Imagine for a second a billionaire businessman who is about to destroy the lives of 800 families with a single signature when an 8-year-old child appears out of nowhere speaking fluent Japanese and completely changes the destiny of all of them. You will not believe what happens at the end of this story that will touch every fiber of your heart, because sometimes the greatest lessons come from the smallest teachers, and today you will discover how. In the gleaming marble hall of Yamamoto Industries in Sao Paulo, the air was thick with the weight of decisions that would change lives forever. 65-year-old Takashi Yamamoto adjusted his security uniform for the last time after 15 years dedicated to the company that now discarded him like a used object. His calloused hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a silent indignation that burned in his chest like forgotten embers. Across the luxurious hall, Hiroto Matsumoto, the corporation CEO, walked with firm, measured steps toward the meeting room where he would sign the contracts that would sell the company to American competitors. His steely eyes betrayed not a shred of remorse for what he was about to do. For him, business was pure mathematics. Emotions were luxuries he couldn't afford, and the 800 employees who would be laid off were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Takashi had arrived from Japan 45 years ago with a heart full of dreams and hands ready to work. He lost his wife, Akiko, in a traffic accident when his son, Kenji, was only 10 years old. He raised the boy alone, working day and night until cruel fate took Kenji in a workplace accident, leaving behind only Hiroshi, an 8-year-old boy who became his grandfather's reason for living. Matsumoto, on the other hand, was the son of Japanese immigrants who had climbed every rung of power, trampling on any sentiment that might hinder their ascent. He had purposefully forgotten his origins, as if he could use money and influence to erase the memories of a humble childhood he considered shameful. In that moment, as Takashi prepared to clean his desk and Matsumoto checked the contracts one last time, neither of them imagined that a small voice speaking in perfect Japanese was about to turn everything upside down in a way that would change their lives forever. What happened next will make you rethink everything about second chances and the transformative power of our origins. If you want to find out how this incredible story unfolds, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment of this exciting journey that will touch your heart deeply. Hiroshi was sitting in the small waiting room on the ground floor, playing with an origami he had made that morning while waiting for his grandfather to finish another day's work. When Matsumoto passed by like a cold gust, without even noticing the presence of the child who was observing everything with his curious and intelligent eyes. The boy didn't know it yet, but in a few hours his life and his grandfather's would be hanging by a thread in the hands of that man in the expensive suit and the seemingly stone heart. Takashi had lied to Hiroshi about why he was taking his grandson to work that particular day. The truth was, he was achieved. He couldn't find anyone to care for the boy, and he knew it would be his last day at the company. He wanted his grandson to see where he had spent the last 15 years of his life, dedicating his sweat and honesty to a corporation that was now throwing him away like disposable waste. Every time he looked at Hiroshi, his chest tightened, thinking about how he would explain that he no longer had the money to pay for the private school where the boy learned Japanese and developed his natural talent for languages, which impressed even the most experienced teachers. On the other side, Matsumoto sat in his top-floor executive office, reviewing for the 10th time the sales contracts that would transform Yamamoto Industries into another piece of the American corporate empire. To him, the decision made perfect financial sense. The numbers were clear, the profits would be astronomical, and the shareholders would be satisfied. What did it matter if 800 families would be left without a livelihood? What did it matter if men like Takashi, who had dedicated their best decades to the company, would be abandoned to their fate? Matsumoto had learned early on that feelings were dangerous luxuries that the weak could not afford, and he had promised himself never again to be weak like his parents. The truth about Matsumoto was darker than any employee could have imagined. His parents, Ichiro and Hanako, had immigration from Japan in the 1960s with simple dreams of a dignified life, but were crushed by prejudice and exploitation from unscrupulous bosses who paid them pittance while enriching themselves with their work. Matsumoto grew up watching his father come home, physically and emotionally destroyed every day until a massive heart attack took him at the age of 52, leaving Hanako a widow with no means to survive. She died 2 years later of heartbreak and poverty, while Matsumoto was still in university, supporting herself with scholarships and night jobs that exhausted, but determined to never again depend on the kindness of others. It was this pain, transformed into ambition, that drove him to climb every rung of power, trampling on anyone who tried to stop him. Matsumoto had convinced himself that being cruel was being intelligent, that being ruthless was being realistic, and that forgetting his humble origins was the only way to ensure he would never again be humiliated or exploited by anyone. He didn't realize he had become exactly the kind of person who destroyed his family decades ago. Meanwhile, Takashi quietly told Hiroshi about the difficult times ahead, without revealing all the details but setting the stage for a painful conversation he would soon have. The boy listened attentively, asking questions in Japanese that demonstrated impressive maturity for his 8 years, and an intuitive understanding of the world's injustices that made Takashi both proud and sad. The gears of fate were already moving in that luxurious building, and none of the 3 protagonists of this story had any idea how their lives were about to intertwine in a way that would change everything forever. The executive elevator at Yamamoto Industries has always been a symbol of status and power, literally separating the executive floors from the rest of the company. But that day it would become an unexpected trap for the most powerful man in the building. Matsumoto entered the elevator at 3 in the afternoon, carrying a black briefcase containing the contracts that would change the fate of 800 families, and pressed the button for the 25th floor, where the final meeting would take place, sealing the deal of the decade. He didn't know that a failure in the electrical system was about to transform those few minutes into a journey of self-discovery that would shake the foundations of everything he believed in. The elevator ascended normally to the 12th floor when a strange noise echoed through the metal structure, and the lights flickered 3 times before going out completely. Matsumoto felt his stomach churn as the elevator stopped abruptly between floors, leaving him trapped in a claustrophobic space that suddenly seemed to shrink around him. The air conditioning stopped working, the silence became deafening, and for the first time in decades, the CEO felt something he had forgotten: pure, irrational fear that could not be controlled with money or influence. Downstairs in the main hall, Takashi was organizing his personal belongings in a cardboard box when emergency alarms began blaring throughout the building. Hiroshi, who was drawing on a piece of paper near the reception desk, looked up in alarm and ran to his grandfather, asking in Japanese what was happening. Takashi explained that it was probably a technical problem, but his 15 years of experience in that building told him something more serious was going on. The maintenance team rushed into the main hall with tools and electronic equipment, trying to determine the problem. The monitoring system showed someone was trapped in the executive elevator, but the technicians estimated it would take at least 40 minutes to restore power and safely release the equipment. It was at that moment that Hiroshi heard something that perked up his keen child's ears, a detail all the adults had missed. From the elevator came a muffled but steady sound. Someone was speaking softly in a language Hiroshi recognized immediately. It was Japanese, but not just any Japanese. It was the dialect specific to the Hiroshima region that his grandfather had taught him through family stories and the traditional songs they sang together every night before bed. The boy approached the elevator door, ignoring the adults trying to keep him away, and pressed his ear against the metal surface. Matsumoto was on the other side, in a state of growing panic, muttering in Japanese the prayers his mother, Hanako, had taught him as a child, and which he had purposely forgotten during decades of denying his origins. He was mentally regressing to the frightened little boy who hid under the bed when his parents fought about money, and who dreamed of a future where he would never again experience humiliation or deprivation. Hiroshi then did something no one expected. He answered the prayers in perfect Japanese, softly singing a traditional song his grandfather had taught him about finding peace in times of despair. The child's angelic voice echoed through the elevator door, reaching Matsumoto like an unexpected bomb that instantly calmed his racing heart. Inside the elevator, Matsumoto stopped mumbling and fell into absolute silence, trying to process what he had just heard. A child was responding to his prayers in fluent Japanese, using expressions and intonations he hadn't heard since his mother's death decades ago. It was as if the universe was sending him a signal in a way he could never have imagined. The Japanese dialogue began hesitantly, with Hiroshi asking if the trapped man was okay, and Matsumoto responding in a choked voice that he was, but that he was very scared. The conversation that followed would begin to break down the barriers Matsumoto had built around his heart. The conversation between Matsumoto and Hiroshi through the elevator door began simply, but quickly deepened in ways neither of them expected. Hiroshi, with his natural childlike innocence, asked the question no adult would dare ask: why the important man was talking to himself in Japanese when there was no one to listen. Matsumoto was silent for several seconds before answering with brutal honesty that surprised him. Sometimes, when we're very scared, we revert to the children we once were, and I was remembering the prayers my mother taught me long ago. Hiroshi then asked where the man's mother was, and Matsumoto felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. She died many years ago, he replied, trying to maintain his composure, but failing miserably as tears he hadn't shed in decades began to stream down his face. The child on the other side of the door said something that echoed through the cold metal like a divine revelation. My mother also died, and my father too, but Grandpa says they are still with us when we remember the good things they taught us. It was at that moment that Takashi approached, concerned about his grandson, who was talking to someone in Japanese. When he realized it was the CEO trapped in the elevator, Takashi was shocked but decided to join the conversation, trying to calm his boss, who was clearly panicking. Matsumoto recognized Takashi's voice and, for the first time in 15 years, truly paid attention to the man who had been invisible to him all this time. Takashi began to tell his story simply and directly about how he had lost his wife, Akiko, in a terrible accident that left him and his son, Kenji, devastated. He worked 3 different jobs to give his son the best education possible. And when Kenji grew up and landed a job on a construction site, Takashi thought they could finally have a more peaceful life. But fate had other plans, and Kenji died in a workplace accident caused by the negligence of his employer, who failed to provide adequate safety equipment, leaving behind only Hiroshi, who was only 2 years old at the time. Matsumoto listened in absolute silence to every word of that story, feeling as if he were looking into a distorted mirror, showing an alternate version of his own life. He, too, had lost his parents early, and had also fought alone against a hostile world, but had chosen a completely different path. While Takashi channeled his grief into love and dedication to his grandson, Matsumoto had transformed his grief into destructive ambition and contempt for the weak. Hiroshi then asked the question that changed everything. Why doesn't the important man like my grandpa if you've both suffered the same hardships in life? Matsumoto was at a loss for an answer because he'd never thought of it that way. He'd spent decades building walls between himself and anyone who might remind him of his humble origins. But Hiroshi was showing him with the innocent wisdom of a child that these walls were prisons he'd built himself. The conversation reached its most intense point when Matsumoto confessed through the elevator door something he had never admitted even to himself. I've become exactly the kind of person who destroyed my family when I was a child. My parents died because cruel bosses exploited them to death, and now I'm the cruel boss who is about to destroy other families like yours. Hiroshi responded with devastating simplicity. So why don't you stop being cruel and start being kind like my grandpa? Takashi felt his heart race as he realized his grandson was asking questions that could cost them both dearly. But Matsumoto surprised everyone by laughing through his tears. It was the bitter, heartbreaking laugh of someone finally seeing the cruel irony of his own existence. He had spent his entire life running from becoming a victim who had becoming the executioner, and now an 8-year-old child was showing the way back to his own humanity. The moment of catharsis was just beginning and the revelations that would follow would transform not just these 3 lives, but the fate of hundreds of families that depended on the decisions that would be made in the next few hours. The maintenance team finally managed to restore power to the elevator, but when the doors opened on the 12th floor, everyone was shocked by what they saw. Matsumoto was sitting on the floor with his suit crumpled, his face wet with tears, and his expression completely different from the cold mask he'd worn for decades. He slowly stood up, and the first thing he did was look into the eyes of Takashi and Hiroshi, who were waiting outside, their faces genuinely concerned. Matsumoto knelt in front of Hiroshi and in perfect Japanese apologized not only to the boy, but to all the generations of their families who had suffered at the hands of men like he had become. Hiroshi looked to his grandfather, as if asking for permission, and Takashi nodded, still trying to process what was happening. The boy then extended his small hand to Matsumoto and said something that would echo forever in the memory of the entrepreneur. Everyone deserves a second chance to choose to be good. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions that would change everything. Matsumoto canceled the meeting with the American investors, personally calling each of them and explaining that he had changed his mind about selling the company. His lawyers found that he had gone mad and tried to argue about the financial implications of breaking already signed contracts. But Matsumoto was adamant in his decision to keep Yamamoto Industries as an independent, family-owned company. Matsumoto's transformation didn't stop there. He called an emergency meeting of all company employees for the next day, and when he addressed the packed auditorium of nervous people waiting to hear about their layoffs, he delivered a speech no one would ever forget. First in Japanese and then in Portuguese, he publicly apologized for years of inhumane treatment and announced revolutionary changes in company policy. Takashi wouldn't be fired. On the contrary, he would be promoted to Human Resources Director with the specific mission of humanizing labor relations within the company. Matsumoto had realized that men like Takashi, who had survived the worst adversities while maintaining their dignity and compassion, were exactly the kind of leadership the company needed. Takashi's salary would triple, and he would have complete autonomy to implement employee wellness and development programs. But the changes were even more profound. Matsumoto announced the creation of the Kenji Yamamoto Institute in honor of Takashi's late son, a foundation that would provide full scholarships to children of company employees, including language classes and cultural exchange programs between Brazil and Japan. Hiroshi would be the program's first beneficiary and would have access to the best teachers of Japanese and other languages that his natural talent deserved to develop. The company also established a new code of conduct based on traditional Japanese principles of mutual respect, honor, and social responsibility. Matsumoto, personally supervision area, he would implement these changes and make a point of knowing each employee by name, something he should have done decades ago. He transformed his top-floor office into a more accessible space where employees of all levels could schedule meetings to discuss ideas or problems. The company's financial figures initially worried shareholders, but something surprising happened in the following months. With motivated and valued employees, productivity soared, innovation flourished, and Yamamoto Industries began to be recognized not only for its results, but also for the revolutionary way it treated its employees. Other companies began to study the Yamamoto model, and Matsumoto became a sought-after speaker at conferences on humanized leadership. Takashi flourished in his new role, discovering he had a natural talent for resolving conflicts and motivating teams. He implemented mentoring programs where more experienced employees guided newcomers and created community spaces where people could share their cultures and personal stories. The company became a true multicultural melting pot where diversity was celebrated rather than tolerated. Hiroshi continued to inspire it all, regularly visiting the office where he was treated as the company's official mascot. His conversations in Japanese with Matsumoto became weekly rituals where the two discussed life, philosophy, and plans for the future of the educational foundation. Matsumoto discovered that being a father figure to Hiroshi filled a void he didn't even know existed in his heart. But the most profound transformation occurred within Matsumoto himself, as he finally made peace with his roots and began honoring his parents' memory in a way they would be proud of. He regularly visited their graves, taking Hiroshi along, and told stories of how two families torn apart by the cruelty of the business world had found each other and healed each other. What no one yet knew was that this story of redemption was just beginning, and the consequences of these changes would spread far beyond the walls of Yamamoto Industries, touching lives in ways that not even Matsumoto could imagine. 6 months after that day that changed everything, Hiroshi ran through the halls of Yamamoto Industries as if it were his second home, because in fact, that's exactly what it had become. Matsumoto had set up a small desk in his office, especially for the boy who came every Friday after school to do homework and chat in Japanese about plans to expand the educational institute that was already transforming the lives of 50 children of company employees. Takashi watched from his new office in the Human Resources Department as the miracle unfolded before his eyes every day. Men and women who had previously been just numbers on spreadsheets now had faces, names, stories, and most importantly, restored dignity. He had implemented a program called Kokoro, meaning heart in Japanese, where each new employee was assigned a veteran mentor and learned not only about the job but also about the family values that now define the company culture. Matsumoto was at his desk signing the final documents to expand the Yamamoto model to other companies in the group when Hiroshi ran in and jumped into his arms, shouting, "Uncle Matsumoto," in Japanese. The CEO, who had previously considered displays of affection a sign of weakness, now completely melted whenever the boy arrived and began religiously setting aside 2 hours every Friday just to talk to Hiroshi about everything and nothing, like real grandfathers do. Matsumoto's transformation was so radical that people who had known him for decades couldn't believe he was the same man. He learned to smile genuinely, greeted employees by name, participated in company birthdays and celebrations, and most importantly, he had rediscovered his ability to cry with laughter and be moved by the small, everyday victories of those around him. The Kenji Yamamoto Institute had become a national model for corporate social responsibility. Hiroshi was now fluent in 4 languages and had become a kind of youth ambassador for the institution, participating in events and sharing his story with other children who needed to believe that their dreams were possible regardless of their family circumstances. Takashi discovered that his life experience and natural ability to see potential in people made him an exceptional leader. Previously invisible employees flourished under his guidance, and the company began to be sought after by the best talent in the market, not for its salaries, though competitive, but for the unique way people were treated and valued there. The story of Yamamoto Industries' transformation became a case study at universities, and Matsumoto began receiving invitations to speak on humanized leadership around the world. But he always made a point of bringing Takashi and Hiroshi with him, because he had learned that his true strength came not from his position or his wealth, but from the genuine relationships he had built with the people who truly mattered. On a particularly moving afternoon, Hiroshi was teaching other children at the institute how to make origami when he turned to the cameras documenting the foundation's work and said something that would become the institution's official motto. "My grandpa always says that we should never forget where we came from because that's what shows us where we should go. And Uncle Matsumoto learned this too, so now our family is much bigger and happier." Matsumoto, watching from afar, felt his eyes well up again, something that had happened frequently since that day in the elevator. He had spent decades believing that strength meant showing no emotion, but he discovered that true courage lay in allowing his heart to guide his business and personal decisions. The company thrived in ways that went far beyond financial numbers. Employees brought their families to visit the workplace. Children played in the gardens Matsumoto had created especially for them, and the corporate environment had transformed into a large extended family where each person knew they were valued and respected. Takashi looked at his grandson, laughing with other children, and at Matsumoto, watching the scene with a proud smile, and knew that his wife, Akiko, and son, Kenji, would be immensely proud of the legacy being built in their name. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from battles won, but from hearts transformed and lives redeemed through the simple, yet revolutionary power of human compassion. This story teaches us that no matter how high we climb in life or how powerful we become, our true measure as human beings lies in how we treat those who seemingly can offer us nothing in return. Because ultimately, it is genuine relationships, not material achievements, that give true meaning to our existence. If this story touched your heart, as it did mine, please leave a like so more people can be inspired by this message of transformation and hope. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss other stories that will touch your soul and remind you that it's never too late to choose to be a better person.